Finishing a quilt is such a great joy, and looking at that quilt and thinking about where it's going to end up, who's going to receive it, what we're going to do with it, it feels terrific. But sometimes we don't get as many finished as we'd like to. Well, that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise, and I have a great quick finish for you for some machine quilting to get those quilts finished and get those quilts completed so they're ready to gift and move on to wherever they need to be so you can move on to your next quilts. So let's go ahead and get started. I do want, though, to ask that you subscribe to my channel. That would be great for me, and a thumbs up would be so perfect. I'd appreciate it. Thank you, and let's go ahead and get started. I'm anxious to show this to you. We're going to do some quick quilting with a walking foot. This is a very easy way to quilt. It's a very effective way because you end up with fewer problems on the back where you can get bunching or wrinkles. So what I've done is I have a backing, and I have a quilt batting, and I have a patchwork that I put on top. And then what I do, these are 5-inch, and I pinned every other square in order to hold it. I always start pinning from the center and work out to the edges, and then I put a pin in every corner. One of the difficulties that you will find if you don't pin your corners is as you're quilting, some of this can fold underneath and get caught as you're quilting over here. And that occurs when you're moving your fabric around. So you need to make sure that everything is secured and you're ready to go. Now, while we can go ahead and use our regular foot, our regular presser foot, the walking foot is incredibly effective because it is made to work with fabric of multiple layers. You've seen me use this in rag quilting before. It's wonderful. It works great on batting, but it is fabulous for machine quilting. Many sewing machines come with this foot already. Others you have to buy it. It is available in universal sizes. There are basically two different elements that create the difference between, and number one, is sometimes you'll get a arm like this that has an opening where we can put the screw into that'll help lift the foot up and down. Notice as I'm lifting, see what's happening? Those feed dogs underneath, they are pulling the fabric on the top of the quilt. So as we're sewing, the lower feed dogs are pulling what's underneath. This keeps the top fabric moving at the same rate. The benefit is the fabric is all moving together, and we're not going to end up with extra quilt top at the end of our quilting or have overhang or have bunching on the back. This really does help eliminate a lot of problems. The other thing that will matter when you're buying is how this is set up. What I'm going to do, let me get my little screwdriver here, is take my entire foot off. So the presser foot is this piece right here. There is also what's called the shank, and that's what the presser foot generally slips in and out of. But we want to take everything off like this, okay? So everything is out. Then what we're going to do is first we're going to loop this around that screw. Now that's, for me, that's the screw that I use to put my needle in with. And so as my needle goes up and down, it's moving the presser foot up and down. Then secondly, this little guy needs to fit right over that screw hole where I took this out in order to change the presser feet. And then just finger turn it as far as you can and give it just a tight turn. You don't have to cinch it super tight and strip your threads. So just go ahead and get that in there so you're good to go. When I start a quilt, I always put a new needle in. The reason being is this is going to be sewing through the quilt top, and I don't want to have a lot of large holes. If the thread gets dull, if the needle gets dull, it tends to not pierce through the quilt as effectively, and you can get a little pull here and there. And I want it to look good, so I use a new needle, and needles are pretty inexpensive. I do save my old needles, because if I'm working on utility stuff or just piecing things, or putting a lot of smaller pieces into larger pieces, I'll use my old needles, run it through, and that's fine until I throw them away. So I have a top thread and a bottom thread, and in this case, I'm using some pretty bold colors so you can see what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is sew from the center. When I am quilting, I always start at one edge. Now, free motion is different. Free motion, I start in the middle. But when I'm doing straight line quilting or walking foot quilting, I go from one edge to the quilt all the way to the other. And there's a couple different things you can do. If you like to stitch in the ditch, this is a great way to do it. You line your needle up right here with the seam and you go. But I don't do that well. My stitching isn't as straight, and I tend to go a little more quickly than I probably should, so therefore I don't always end up in the seam. So I find the most forgiving quilting is to do a long sweeping S-curve, and by doing that you are allowing yourself flexibility, and there is nothing that you need to match up, because every little line is going to be a bit different. So let me go ahead and get this set up. I'm going to put my needle in there. And I almost forgot my quilting gloves. These are really good. They're a bit stretchy, so they provide a little support to your hands. But more importantly is they're dipped in like a, I don't know, whatever kind of material that is. But it's a plastic kind of thing, a rubber. And it's like your garden gloves, or scrubbing gloves. And what this does is it allows you to grip without slipping. So I'm going to be sewing like this. So I'm going to need to be turning my fabric just the littlest bit as I swerve. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is lengthen my stitch just a little bit. I will either sew at the same stitch length as I do my piecing, or one little notch longer. And I do that because it allows for the fabric to kind of adjust, all three layers to sort of adjust with the thread. And I just think it looks better. If you use too small a stitch, then it can get really tight and bunch up. Too long a stitch and it gets loose and floppy. And it's just a preference, a personal preference of what you like. And once you get started, you're going to find out what works best for you. So I pulled my thread in, and I want to pull my bobbin thread up. Now, a lot of times what can happen is your bobbin thread can knot up on the bottom. So if we keep it to the top, we're not going to have any knotted messes, and it just kind of keeps things nice and clean. And then I'll just do a couple little stitches right there, or you can back stitch. And so this will just get cut off. So now that my threads are locked in, I'm going to start by doing my curve. There are a couple ways you can do this, and this is the easiest, and that's why we're going to start here. So we just want to go over a little bit this way, and then come a little bit this way. And don't put yourself in any pressure that you have to match up on the corners. The biggest thing is, as you're coming around on the outside, look at where your needle is in conjunction with the side of your presser foot. You want to kind of stay on the same equal side of the seam. So when I come this way, I'm going to let my presser foot come out about the same distance, and then I'm going to swing it around and come down this way and just work back and forth. And then I'm going to sew right off the end and give it a quick tight stitch, and then I'm going to cut that and go back to the beginning. So you can see as we went along, it just went nice and smooth. Now see, that is not a perfect curve, but that's okay. You know, it just, this is not about perfection. This is just about doing something really fun that you enjoy and making it work. Now, you can decide to go every curve in the same direction. So starting here, I can always go this way, or you can mix it up. And quite honestly, I prefer to mix it up because if I start in the same direction, I'm going to tend to want to follow that same curve. And we can't follow that exact same line. We can try and come close, but that's not the place where we want to learn how to quilt. So again, I'm going to pull my bobbin thread up, and I'm going to start right here. So I'll sew a couple stitches to lock myself in, and I'm just going to start going this way. Because whether you start here or there doesn't matter, because through the course of this line of quilting, you're going in both directions anyways. Now, as I'm sewing, I am using my hands to hold my fabric apart. I'm not pulling it, but I'm holding it, so there's a bit of not so much tension as it's laying flat, and I don't have to worry about getting pleats or tucks on the back, and it just sort of keeps everything nice and neat. And then I can just sew right off the end down here. Okay, so there we go. We now have 2 lines. And now I'm going to do a line at the outer edge. All right, in order to sew down the edge, instead of doing the curve, I'm going to actually baste all 3 layers while I'm here, and then I'll do the quilting inside of that. So what I do is I put my presser foot right along the edge of the fabric, but if I sew with my needle in the center position, that's going to be pretty darn close to 1/4 of an inch, and I don't want this to show on the top. So I set my needle over to the right, to the far side over here. So as I'm lining up the side of my presser foot with my fabric, my needle is going to be less than 1/4 inch away. So let me go ahead and get this started. And I'm just going to let the machine do the work. Now what I do when I sew, when I have multiple layers, is I don't want to say I stretch it, but I hold it taut. That means that there aren't any wrinkles laying down and that everything is going to lay nice and smooth. And I don't know if that's something I've learned through quilting or when I used to sew clothes for so many years. And it just seems to work for me. And I've never taken any formal sewing classes, so I don't know if that is a technique or a technical method, but I do know it works. So I'm just going to run this all the way down the edge, and like I said, it's not unlike a basting stitch. So there we go. We have a nice edge here. I can remove this pin, and you can just take your pins out as you go along. I pinned them in the center of the square so they won't get in my way while I'm getting my grid set up to determine just how we're going to quilt this. All right, I'm going to start about 1/2 inch in, because you see from here to here is probably pretty close to 1/2 inch. And I'm just going to run this way. And just work it all the way down. And then we come right down to the edge, and I sew right off. I don't, lock the stitch or back tack. Now see, this isn't super curvy, but, we're going to get the idea. So one of the things that we think about is how we're going to completely quilt this. When I have specific blocks like this, I like to go through and put in like a holding pattern that will keep everything in place. So then I can have all my pins out and I can do whatever quilting I want. So you can certainly do something like this, create your rows. This I like doing on the seam because it also reinforces those seams. But now you could come back and do some free motion, and we will do some of that. But right now I just want to focus on working with this kind of a setup where we do our grid lines and then go in between. Actually, I'm going to leave that pin in there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start back here so I don't have to worry about my knotting. The knotting is important when you are, for example, if you have to rethread along the way. You'll pull your bobbin loop up, pull that thread out, and then just continue sewing. You'll back up just the littlest bit, stitch over the thread, and continue. And that way you don't get a knot on the back. So it's good practice to do that, simply so that you know how to do it. So what you see here is I turned the quilt, what do I want to say, my quilt layers to my quilt sandwich. That's the word, I couldn't think of it. And I turned it in the opposite direction, so I'm sewing the other way. Now see, if I don't have my hands here, how that gets bulky. I just want to like straighten that out because I don't want to have the chance of getting a lump of fabric that folds over, it gets pleated, and see how I just put my hands in there and it sort of holds everything nicely. All right. So let's say that this is done all the way through, and we're going to pretend I did that edge. I don't want to take up your time with that. Just going to be the same thing I did before. Now, you can decide what you want to do with your quilting. There's a couple things to think about. Your batting comes in different, oh my gosh, so many different varieties. There are some that require you quilt every 3 inches. This one in particular goes up to every 8 inches. The difference is the density of the batting. When the batting is very dense, that means it's going to hold together better without reinforcement over a greater distance. And I know when I use the real thin batting, I do tend to quilt a little closer because that's something that can pull apart and actually separate. So you just need to look at the instructions on your batting and see what it recommends and make sure you quilt it this much. Now these are 5-inch squares, so these are 4.5 inch apart. This is more than enough quilting. And I could even go across this way, but I'll tell you, as a beginner, I would just quilt everything in one direction first. Get comfortable with that, and then we can do a cross quilt seam. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and add another. Now, what I like to do, instead of going down the middle, I kind of like to have 3 together and leave an open space. Because that way this quilts and it's tighter. This is looser. You have a little bit more of the quilted look with the looser fabric. After you wash it, you'll see that difference. So I'm going to come over about 1/2 inch from the farthest part, or actually I'm going to come more than that because I want to have my line not be any closer than right here. So if I want that line right there, I look, okay, I need to be approximately 1 presser foot away from the seam. So I'll come up here and I'm going to be a presser foot away from my seam, and I'm going to quilt in the opposite direction. Again, that, or I can start my loop up here and kind of follow through, but yet go on a different path. Because see, when you go like this, you're going to get caught, and you're going to want to try and follow that same loop. So I'm going to go ahead and readjust. Now I'm coming into this one. And again, there's no right or wrong. You are the creator here. You're the quilter. And this can be whatever it is you want to be. Now, I can tell you, I did not get my curves very wide. And that's okay. I can live with that. So I'm going to come out here. So this one, I'm going to come in. So I'm going to remove my pins because we're done with these. I'm going to leave these outer ones in because I haven't finished that outer edge. And then let's go ahead and come out just a little bit like this. I'm going to come this way. And you want to leave a good 1/2 inch or so between your lines of quilting. So I can get right there, I can get within about a 1/2 inch, but I don't want to get more than that. You can, and with practice, I think you'd be more comfortable with it. But right now, that's probably not going to be within your comfort zone. And it's more about tension and handling the fabric and how that all works for you. So I just quilted just some squiggly lines, and, you know, we can go back in and do more, which is kind of a fun thing to do. So let's go ahead and let's just put a line in. And I'm going to make these shorter so that my swirls, my what do I call these, my curves, kind of fall in between and don't follow exactly the same. And because this is already quilted on both sides, I don't have to worry about folding the fabric because everything is secured really well. Now let's go back and we'll do one more here. And let's see, I'm going to kind of come in this way. And you let the walking foot do the work. See, I don't even have to move the fabric. It's being drawn along by the walking foot perfectly and at the right rate, so the fabric and the thread lines up properly, and we get some great even stitches. And see how easy that was after those first lines are put in. Going back and adding more makes it very easy. So let's take a look at the back. And see, we've got our quilting. It looks good. Now see, these are the knots. If you don't pull your thread through, this is very, but I did that in the batting, so that's going to come off. I'm not worried about it, but that is something to consider. And so this looks really good. Another thing you want to look for is tension. If the thread on the top is coming to the bottom, that means that this bobbin thread is not locking in. The thread should cross in the center within the quilt batting. So you should only see bottom thread here and only see top thread here. If that's not the case, you need to adjust your tension. And your manual will tell you whether to tighten or loosen it, depending on how your tension works. Well, after knocking my camera over, I did have to realign and reset up here a bit. So I'm not sure if I'm in the same place on the screen. I hope I am in a general sort of way. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and finish quilting these 3 seams, and then I'll show you what that looks like at the end. And here's the finished sample with the 5 strips of quilting. And I did 3 on the ends. That just seemed to work well since it's sort of on the center. And I really like how these 5 lines all work together. And you saw how easy this is to do. And you get your basic line down the center, put a couple on the outside, and then just go down in this, middle here between those 2 outer lines, and it goes together very quickly. And this is something I know you can do. This is an easy first step to quilting, but it's also a fun and quick way to get a quick quilt finished. But look at how great the back looks. There's no tucks, there's no bunches. Everything just lays really well the way it's supposed to. And that's it. So I'm so glad you're here. I'm glad you got to do this, to share this with me, and I can't wait for you to do it yourself. Just get a couple pieces, practice like this. You saw how quick and easy this was. It's a fun project, and before you know it, you're going to have all kinds of quilts finished and ready to go. Next is binding. I've got one already coming. That video will be around soon. But in the meantime, I do hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't subscribed already, please do, and give me a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great day.